Algerian nationalist leaders seized by France are manacled at the Algiers airport, to which they were diverted by French security authorities. A plane which was carrying the quintet from Rabat to Tunis, where they were to take part in a conference with Tunisian and Moroccan leaders, was ordered by radio to change its course and to head for Algiers. The pilot, a Frenchman, obeyed, and the leaders, taken completely by surprise, were arrested when they landed here. A trick that sets off a new wave of violence in North Africa. On the border between Israel and Egypt, a troop of Israeli frontier guards patrol a troubled area. The locale being that described in the sensational announcement by the Little Republic that its forces have penetrated deep into Egypt's Sinai Desert in the direction of the Suez Canal. An assault, it is said, that had to be made because of constant Egyptian military attacks on Israeli citizens and the mining of land and sea approaches to the Republic. It's a time of border trouble for Israel, and another incident on the Jordanian frontier results in a roundup of Arab infiltrators. Action that follows an attempt by these illegal entrants into the country to terrorize the Israeli populace living near this troubled line. On a state visit to Tunisia, Sultan Mohammed V of Morocco is escorted by the Bey of Tunis as he makes a triumphal tour of the North African port city. The Moroccan ruler is in Tunis to discuss proposals for a North Africa union and to try and work out a plan with the French for an honorable peace for Algeria, a stand that rates him an enthusiastic reception. But next day, Tunis, with all the Arabian world, is in ferment, a situation caused by the news of the arrest of 5 Algerian nationalists who were flying here for talks with the Sultan and the Bey. It's a tense situation which brings soldiers to the streets to keep the peace, but indignant mobs are everywhere. The action of the French in diverting the plane on which the Arab leaders were flying is regarded as piracy, and protest meetings must be broken up to prevent rioting, causing Tunisian Premier Habib Bourguiba to call a conference to calm the populace by announcing France will release the seized men. Its principles again challenged by the events in the Middle East, the United Nations Security Council holds a solemn session in which all parties to the dispute have their say. Movietone bringing you the highlights.
Israel is not out to conquer any new territory, but is determined to wipe out the bases in the Sinai wilderness from which murder and death and destruction are launched against her.
Security Council, noting that the armed forces of Israel have penetrated deeply into Egyptian territory in violation of the armistice agreement between Egypt and Israel, expressing its grave concern at this violation of the armistice agreement. 1, it calls upon Israel immediately to withdraw its armed forces behind the established armistice lines. 2, calls upon all members, A, to refrain from the use of force or threat of force in the area in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. B, to assist the United Nations in ensuring the integrity of the armistice agreements. C, to refrain from giving any military, economic, or financial assistance to Israel as long as it has not complied with this resolution.
In these circumstances, and since a vote today is being insisted on, I shall be obliged to vote against the draft resolution.
The dramatic voting followed as Britain and France vetoed 2 separate United States and Soviet resolutions for an immediate ceasefire. But the body did succeed in calling an emergency session of the General Assembly, and though Britain and France again voted no, the decision was not vetoable. The U.S. in strange company fighting for peace. Now joined by British and French forces, the Israeli army that thrust into Egypt to precipitate a new Middle East crisis makes a brave show at a final inspection by General Moshe Dayan, field commander. A modern striking force, it swept to success in the Sinai Desert, cutting off the Gaza Strip to effect an amphibious landing near the Suez Canal after routing 20,000 Egyptian troops. Diverted from all other concerns by the crisis in the Middle East, President Eisenhower is in a grave mood as he addresses the nation from Washington on the critical situation.
On Sunday, the Israeli government ordered total mobilization. On Monday, their armed forces penetrated deeply into Egypt and to the vicinity of the Suez Canal, nearly 100 miles away. And on Tuesday, the British and French governments delivered a 12-hour ultimatum to Israel and Egypt, now followed up by armed attack against Egypt. The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, to dissent. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. I therefore have no plan to call the Congress in special session. Of course, we shall continue to keep in contact with congressional leaders of both parties. I assure you your government will remain alert to every possibility of this situation and keep in close contact and coordination with the legislative branch of this government. The peace we seek and need means much more than mere absence of war. It means the acceptance of law and the fostering of justice in all the world.
A captured Egyptian standard is displayed for the Movietone News cameraman with Israel's punitive expedition into the Sinai Peninsula, where knocked-out Egyptian tanks and silenced enemy batteries mark the advance of the Israeli fighters. Though captured Egyptian wounded are treated with every consideration. Too late for the dead comes the news that Israel has notified the United Nations that it accepts the General Assembly's ceasefire appeal. But an anxious world hears the news with hope, for it can mean peace here too. For this is the disputed Gaza Strip, where a lightning strike by an Israeli force bottled up 20,000 crack Egyptian troops, and a continuance of the hostilities could result in their slaughter. Israel now claims complete control of the Strip, and the latest activities of the Republic's forces are confined to mopping up operations, which may be the last in the whole Middle East crisis. The latest news incidental to the release of these pictures being that Britain has told the UN that it has ordered all bombings to stop forthwith. News flashed immediately to all Israeli, French, and British advance units. With an interest based on the deep patriotism of the Israeli for their reborn homeland, the population of the Republic follow the news from the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip with anxious concern. While in Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities, armed civilian patrols are ready for any emergency. And everywhere throughout the country, girls too young for more active duties work day and night assembling first aid kits for the front. In tow to Haifa, the Egyptian destroyer Ibrahim Awal is an early prize in this latest outbreak of hostilities between Israel and Egypt. Crippled by rocket-firing jet bombers, the destroyer was captured after a 3-hour battle, the first surface ship in history to surrender to aircraft. In London's famed Trafalgar Square, a reverberation of the crisis in the Middle East sees a crowd of countless thousands protesting Sir Anthony Eden's intervention policy in Egypt. Organized by the National Council of Labor, the mass meeting is addressed by labor radical Anarin Bivan, a polemic oration that goads the crowd into demanding the resignation of the Prime Minister. Your Movietone News cameraman went right along with the Anglo-French expedition against Egypt to be at Port Said to film the start of the amphibious attack on the Mediterranean mouth of the Suez. An advance that was followed after bitter fighting in the taking of Said and Port Fouad. Claimed to have as its objective the restoration of order in the Middle East, the action also engages paratroopers, with France contributing one of its crack regiments of camouflage sky fighters, ready for the invasion at 0 hour, which a British transport spearheads carrying a company of airborne islanders. The first objective is an Egyptian army airfield outside Port Said, and there's no hesitation by the Tommies, though they jump into a cackling inferno of ack-ack. Paratroopers soon controlled the canal zone shown below, after which the UN ceasefire plan was accepted by the invaders, but not before the waterway was closed by Egyptian sinkings of blockade ships. Landing of French commandos at Port Fouad, east of the Suez Canal, proceeds as a jet bombing just about paralyzes the Egyptian defenses. And scenes reminiscent of many Allied invasions during World War II are enacted in strength for the first time since the end of that conflict. Hardly any Egyptian resistance is met, and the French are soon in the city, rounding up the remnants of Colonel Nasser's army that failed to... But sunken ships dotting the canal make the value of the action questionable, doubly so now that it halts here. France with Britain agreeing to a ceasefire at the request of the United Nations. Port Said, the major city on the west bank of the Suez, the British had a real tough time. They ran into heavy fire and had to fight desperately to achieve their objective and maintain the time schedule as agreed upon with their French allies. Evidence of the fury of the battle is everywhere throughout this great port, one of the world's most vital shipping centers. Colonel Nasser's agreement to allow a United Nations police force to patrol the Suez came too late to prevent this desolation. Cappuccino Airport, Naples, the word of Nasser's agreement to the UN police force starts the first contingent Suezward. It's a unit from Denmark and will be transported to its Egyptian patrol post by U.S. Globemasters. Arriving from the west to avoid frontal attacks on densely populated areas, Israeli forces from the Sinai Desert occupy the troubled Gaza Strip, taking early precautions that keep to a minimum incidents that could provoke bloodshed. A peaceful occupation that allows the native populace maximum freedom. Later, after a flight on a reconnaissance plane over the Sinai Peninsula, Movietone News visits with the Israeli troops, which defeated the Egyptians in this desert no man's land. Considered an act of self-preservation, the expedition results in the fall of the Egyptian fortress at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was firing on shipping bound for Israel. It yields thousands of prisoners to the victorious forces, with $40 million worth of battle equipment which Cairo recently received from Soviet Russia. Rating cheers for General Moshe Dayan, Israeli Commander-in-Chief. Sitting in Jerusalem, the Israeli parliament upholds Premier Ben-Gurion's decision to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. His country's objectives attained, the premier by his action obeys the UN and proves Israel is not seeking to expand territorially. But $40 million worth of captured equipment, most of it recently supplied by Russia, proves to Israel's satisfaction that Colonel Nasser, spurred by the Kremlin, was considering aggressive action from the Sinai Peninsula. What other reason, the Israeli ask, could Cairo have for maintaining this vast war potential in a desert, except to provide its suicidal Fatayyins with the wherewithal for their raids? a vast prize to a lightning strike that upsets the communist timetable. As shortages follow the disruption caused by the Anglo-French action around the Suez Canal, the city of Port Said has to resort to bread rationing. The British, after taking the city following a 2-day struggle, are pulling out. But food shipments to the port have dwindled, which makes getting home with your bread allotment precarious. As bands of hungry youngsters roam the streets and set upon lone wayfarers who happen to be carrying provisions. Port Said's police fled with the Egyptian army. The area is at the mercy of these young ones with appetites. The harbor of Port Said, which is the canal's major seaport on the west bank, is revealed as a graveyard of sunken ships. A gesture by the Egyptians to thwart the main objective of the Anglo-French invasion, which was to keep the vital waterway open. But with the fighting all over, the canal is blocked and may continue so for months. Meanwhile, in another part of Port Said, the British troops who took the city only a few days ago are being withdrawn, an action complying with the United Nations Assembly's decision. The Tommies are being returned to Cyprus, from where the assault on the Suez was launched. All of which brings Canada's General Burns, who will command the United Nations Suez Police, on an inspection tour of the area to be patrolled, starting from Abu Suwair on the west of the canal near Ismailia. A force for peace. The first unit to land behind the Egyptian lines is brought in by Swiss airplanes chartered by the United Nations. Outside Port Said, members of the United Nations Ceasefire Observation Party prepare for a tour between the front lines of the opposing forces at the Suez Canal. 9 white-painted Jeep station wagons carry the observers, who make their inspection over the narrow canal causeway, where separated only by 250 yards, the Anglo-French and Egyptian armies face each other. Meanwhile, the canal's big West Bank city, Port Said, which was captured by the British, takes advantage of the ceasefire to go about business as usual, its citizens fraternizing with the invaders, who were careful to avoid trouble. In the sidewalk cafes, the men enjoy the normal nip, and on the streets, gossiping women the everyday quip, and a roving still photographer, a snap. A triumph for the United Nations that sees peace instead of panic. Meanwhile, troubled by the general Middle East situation, the leaders of 9 Arab states assemble at Beirut, Lebanon, to discuss problems they share in common. Described as the most significant party ever held by the Arab League, 3 kings and 2 presidents are in attendance, though President Nasser of Egypt is conspicuously absent to be represented by his ambassador here. The talks, it is said, will be aimed at keeping the Soviets out of the Middle East while defending Arab rights in the West. Parading through Port Said, the United Nations police force for the Suez Canal is given a rousing welcome by the citizens of the West Bank city. It's a spontaneous demonstration, but British troops are forced to clear the way for the peace patrol when communist agitators in the crowd try to provoke the Egyptians into an unfriendly attitude. But the people refuse to be deluded and recognize the force for what it is. And the United Nations patrol for peace at the vital waterway becomes an historic fact. The patrol action of the United Nations will mean the quick release of these thousands of Egyptian prisoners held somewhere in Israel. They were captured by Israeli forces in the battles of the Sinai Desert. When deserted by their officers, they surrendered with $40 million worth of arms supplied by Russia and Czechoslovakia. Described as suicidal Fedayeen commandos, they look anything but in the humility of their imprisonment. Meanwhile, throughout Western Europe, as here in Paris, the shortage of gas caused by the sabotaging of the Suez recalls the fuel famines of World War II, a situation that will continue until the United Nations patrol makes possible the removal of the sunken ships that now block the international waterway. Today, the shortage in France is so acute, the government issued orders that the petrol on hand be reserved for doctors and nurses, etc., etc. Looking from Port Said at the Suez Canal, your Movietone News camera catches a British man-of-war proceeding through the waterway. The first ship of any kind to move over the canal since the crisis precipitated by the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt. Another achievement of the United Nations emergency force headed by Canada's General Burns, shown here at Port Said with General Cately, commander of the British forces in the area. General Burns is in Egypt to set up headquarters at the ceasefire line between the Anglo-French and Egyptian forces, an action that coincides with the departure of British troops from the city on the Suez. A praiseworthy British gesture in deference to the United Nations and in the cause of peace. For the British lost many Tommies to the fierce Egyptian opposition they encountered taking the port. Putting into Toulon, the French hospital ship La Marseillaise returns to France 140 soldiers wounded during the recent Anglo-French action in the vicinity of the Suez Canal. Casualties of a surprise invasion that was made without the knowledge of the United States. 240 civilians were also evacuated by the hospital ship, foreigners banished by the Egyptians in reprisal for the Anglo-French attack. They will be sent to their respective consulates as soon as possible. Shocked by the recent easy defeats of the regular Egyptian army and its loss of nearly all the weapons supplied it by the Kremlin, the citizens of Cairo formed a liberation army, a force of civilians which staged this resistance parade to attract recruits. Many women volunteered, but they won't be needed. The invading Anglo-French-Israeli forces, obeying the United Nations, are withdrawing from the ancient land. Egypt wasn't off the critical list a day when Syria, another of the world's most ancient lands, became a trouble spot. With a case of jitters that set it training a great number of so-called volunteers to handle the arms it too was supplied by the Kremlin. Without rhyme or reason, Damascus, encouraged by Soviet propaganda, says it is going to be attacked by the West, and it doesn't want to suffer the fate of Egypt and lose all its new arms to ignorance in handling them. Proving worthy members of the United Nations, Israeli troops leave the Sinai Desert as directed by Secretary General Hammarskjöld. True, they've rid the region of the sneak raiders on Israel who made it their home. But the action shows the Republic to be aware of its international obligations and its desire for peace. But at Haifa, the arrival of new hundreds of Jewish refugees must make Israel wonder if its peaceful overtures are not misunderstood. For these Jews, after all their worldly possessions had been confiscated, have been driven out of Egypt. Victims of the petty spirit of revenge, they add to the rolls of the world's homeless due to communist troublemaking. In comparative peace after many troubled months, Nicosia on the island of Cyprus feels the gasoline shortage caused by the Suez Canal crisis. Official business gets him a half pint, though even this is better than sanguinary guerrilla warfare. The first NATO Council meeting since the breach between the Allies over the Suez brings Secretary of State Dulles to Paris to try to end the discord caused by the Anglo-French action in Egypt. Selwyn Lloyd, British Foreign Minister, and French Foreign Minister Christian Pineau are in a conciliatory mood for the meeting, which becomes a forum for interpreting the foreign policies of all member nations. Descending from the plane that flew him home to England across the Atlantic, Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden looks tanned and fit as he returns to London from his 3 weeks holiday in Jamaica. He's confident, too, that time will justify his policy on the Suez Canal.
The formation of a United Nations force could be the turning point in the history of the United Nations. I am convinced, more convinced than I've been about anything in all my public life, that we were right, my colleagues and I, in the judgment and the decision we took, and that history will prove itself.
Before returning to England in compliance with the United Nations request, British soldiers stage a house-to-house search in Port Said for an officer kidnapped by Egyptian fanatics. Every building of the Suez Canal city is systematically explored for the missing man, a 20-year-old officer of the West Yorkshire Regiment. A car used by the abductors was found covered with bloodstains as the British round up and question all Egyptian males over 15, some of whom were held. With United Nations troops now in control of the area, the last of the invading British troops leave the Suez Canal city of Port Said. A withdrawal that is followed quickly by the return of Egyptian forces to the delight of the citizens. An effigy of a British Tommy is hung as a mob of Egyptians go on to demolish a statue of de Lesseps. A sickening, stupid mob gesture, for he was the brilliant Frenchman whose courage and foresight built the Suez Canal. Nationalism is rampant during the demonstration, and the raising of an Egyptian flag is a signal for general rejoicing.
At the western end of the Suez Canal, the Danish salvage ship Protector puts over the first divers who will actually start working on submerged ships that are blocking the waterway. Under the direction of United Nations experts, the Danes, with divers from several other nations, will begin by clearing away major obstructions first. Later, they'll go to work on removing smaller hulks and wreckage from the canal's edges. A signal for hope that it will not be long before a passage is cleared for at least small boats. At Port Said, the last batch of Egyptian prisoners of war captured during the Anglo-French invasion of the Suez Canal zone are being repatriated. These particular men were fortunate in falling into the hands of the considerate British Tommies. And now, all cleaned up and well-fed, they go back to Cairo, none the worse physically for their experience. Of course, they're a little chagrined at the ease with which they were captured.
It's life as usual in the Gaza Strip, and the prophets of old could return here and mark little change. The momentary excitement caused by Israel's cleanup of raiding Fedayins in the Sinai Desert is over, and Jeremiah or Mohammed could feel at home in these marketplaces. A United Nations truck lends a note of modernity to the scene, which shows the Western world conforming to a Christian principle. An enterprise of care, the package purveyors, which sees to it that the children of the Arab refugees living in the Strip are fed. Striking his colors not in defeat, but to attest national responsibility, Israel's General Moshe Dayan withdraws his army from the Sinai Peninsula. An action at El Arish made in deference to United Nations directives. But it is over at Rafah in Israel that the little Mideast republic proves itself not only responsible, but generous. As under United Nations supervision, it returns 5,000 Egyptian prisoners of war for 4 Israeli soldiers who were captured during the Sinai invasion. The exchange was organized by the Red Cross, and it's carried out by Yugoslavian United Nations police forces using Yugoslav mobile units. A joint Red Cross United Nations triumph. crisis in the Middle East over Israel's last-minute delay in withdrawing its forces from disputed areas brings U.S. Ambassador Lawson to see Premier David Ben-Gurion at Tel Aviv. It's a visit of reassurance to help the Premier with his own cabinet, which opposes him on his withdrawal policy. The meeting has the desired results, and at an Israeli post in the Gaza Strip, the Republic's troops still held there hear the flash that they too will be pulled out, which joins General Dayan and General Burns at Lydda Airport to complete plans for the latter's UN emergency force to occupy the Strip and the Gulf of Aqaba area. Protesting giving up the Gaza Strip and the Aqaba area, the populace of Jerusalem gives the police a hard time. But Premier Ben-Gurion's policy to heed the United Nations appeal to Israel prevails. A decision causing the evacuation of Sharm el-Sheikh, commanding the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba, with the Republic's troops being returned to Eilat at the head of the Gulf. Biblical Gaza, too, is affected, and Canada's General Burns, heading a UN emergency force, confers with Colonel Lindquist, commander of a Danish unit that is taking over this section from the Israeli, aided by a crack Canadian contingent. General Moshe Dayan, who led the lightning strike against the Egyptians, directed the evacuations in both areas, movements that continued without cessation round the clock. Communist provocateurs have been active in the city of Gaza, and spurred by these hate mongers, the natives shout obscenities at the UN force and later stone the men. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Eisenhower signs the bill that makes his Mideast doctrine effective. He describes it as an expression by Congress and the administration of a determination to help Middle East countries preserve their independence, a pledge in the interest of world freedom.